So here we have a tweet from former Vercel employee Matt Pocock, who is talking about how bad AGENTS.md files can make the agent worse and cost you more tokens, obviously, with the static context. There's so much conversation going around right now about like avoiding static context, giving as little as possible, and just using search. It's so interesting because I kind of miss the wave of the static context. I was always just like, once Cursor could search for the files, I should just give it the most vague thing possible, let it come back to me, and then I can evaluate if it's right or wrong. I don't know if people felt like the harnessing creates more success, and definitely prompting, at least with like agent products, right, where I have like an agent running things, the prompt is so important, which is like the static context, but also giving it the tools is kind of the next generation. So long story short, he has this AGENTS.md where you can ask it to refactor and remove a bunch of stuff that's duplicated or overly obvious, for example. But it really is like specific prompting, training it to know when to look, what to look for. It really gets back to like first principles and kind of gets to human intelligence as well, and just how we think and how we learn. So it's cool to see how that is kind of blending together now as these agents are getting more advanced. Some more classic X drama about whether or not AI is killing all of our jobs and making software engineering obsolete versus all of us who work as software engineers trying to cope or just be realistic about where AI is at and what the next steps are in the industry. So this guy was posting, he was like, SaaS is cooked. AI reduces the demand of any BS SaaS. A team of 3 to 4 engineers can recreate most of these products in less than 3 months. And we have Jackie, who is founder of Craft My PDF. I don't know. I think he was kind of popular right at the beginning of like agents and just AI in general, but I 100% agree with what he's saying here, which is like none of these vibe coded tools have actually been launched. Like there's really no vibe coded, like fully production Slack replacement, Discord replacement, like any of these, all of them are just vibe coded greenfield and then trash. And, if you're not posting the .env to the GitHub repo, then you're lucky, So I think vibe coding is amazing, and like I'm building so many products with the power of AI and just doing my job and all of that, and just software engineering is 100% changed forever, which is like what Theo's saying. However, the actual like sandboxed code delivery is such a small piece of software startups, and the maintenance, the upgrades, bug fixes, onboarding docs, security patches, and all of that is just purely engineering. That's not even focusing on marketing, sales, fundraising, business model. And you have to look at these things as like, you can generate another project, right? You can vibe code it, but there's still opportunity cost where people are not going to be working on products that don't make money. And that's why you have so many payroll software companies. That's why Ramp's worth like 30 plus bill, is because people need that product. So you can do like these toys and be like, okay, we're going to recreate Discord, but it's like Discord doesn't even have a good business model, Like I'm sure they've succeeded and they can figure it out and it's a great product, but you launching a new chat app is not going to make any money. Nobody's launching a new social media and making any money. It's just how it is. So the vibe coding is definitely going to change the high impact software that gets delivered, and people that can deliver software are going to be more efficient, and the demand will meet that efficiency per like Jevons paradox. But in terms of like actual SaaS going away, I don't think it's happening. Everyone just wants to sign into Google, pay $50 a month or pay $50 per seat or whatever, and then get a really polished product that the company cares about. Nobody wants to self-host and worry about databases and Docker files that take 10 minutes to deploy and update. Next, we have Dax from OpenCode talking about this very realistic thing that people are starting to get. I feel like I was saying this early, where people were like, oh, why can't I use my Claude Max 200 on OpenCode or Cursor or wherever? It's like, no, it's a promo, They're giving away $2,000 of inference. I've seen up to $3,000 of inference for $200 with Claude Max, and they want you to use Claude Code to use it. And it does create this really interesting predicament where how can companies deliver $2,000 for $200? It's the same theoretically as selling $10 bills for $1 per person, There is a usage piece to it where it's like how much of people are actually getting the $2,000 of inference because the credits don't roll over, obviously. But this is like kind of one of those Uber moments where it's like Uber was $5, to go across town for a while, and now it's $25. And it's like venture capital funded systems and trying to gain a competitive edge and market share. And it's on us as engineers to take advantage of it. I saw another tweet yesterday that was like, everyone's just maxing out Claude Code to try to afford their own home lab, Just a quick little update on Claude Code from Boris, where now if you do the planning mode, which everyone loves. I think the planning mode's amazing, but it will like clear your context now to run the plan, which is cool. So essentially like you have all your chat context while you're doing the planning, but then once it comes up with the document, it's just going to clear the context and run that document only. Kind of speaks to like what people are saying where they're trying to reduce static context as much as possible. I guess a chat history isn't necessarily static context, but they want to have as minimal input tokens as possible so that the model itself can figure out which tools it needs to call or where it needs to get context from, and then just kind of let it operate and come back to you with a completed solution. There is also another piece too where it's like people are really starting to understand the refinement of the tickets happens in the planning mode, right? So it's very conversational, but then you come out with this artifact, which is like a design document. You know, the super experienced engineers were doing this the whole time, but it's like about accessibility and how now all of us can do really nice design documents without having to spend like 3 hours on it. And then the sandboxed code itself, the code review and the deliverable is all kind of a later step, you know? It's not really engineering work, it's almost product work in a way. Next, we have a pretty cool tweet from Elon that the AI5 chip design is in good shape, according to him. So Tesla is restarting work on Dojo 3. The AI5 chip is like their hardware AI chip, which is built in the Teslas for full self-driving, and also the Optimus robots. I guess it'll also be used for reasoning or neural processing, is my understanding. And Dojo 3 is their like supercomputer data center. So I guess they're restarting work on that. I'm not sure exactly what the details are of like just expanding gigawatts or getting more GPUs or software improvements, but they are hiring. So if you're in this space and interested on working on AI chips at Tesla, you can email AI_chips@tesla.com with 3 bullet points on the toughest technical problems you solved. That gives me so much PTSD because I remember one time I was trying to get a job at Gumroad and he was like, send me 3 bullet points on what you've worked on, but instead I sent more of like a traditional message with like kind of my history and like what I've worked on, and we literally got to the last step and then he canceled on me last second because I didn't send those 3 bullet points. Was kind of his excuse. So make sure you send only 3 bullet points and be very specific about the toughest technical problems you've solved. Okay, here we have a Cloudflare engineer working on agents talking about kind of types of projects that do really well with coding agents, and I feel like I have an interesting take on this. So what he's saying is that you can do vibe coding, right, where you have a UI app layer that doesn't have to be quote-unquote stable, is one piece where the agents are really good. But then he says the other piece as well is that highly spec'd projects with well-understood behavior is cursors build me a browser, which I guess makes sense, like very defined. Like if you're going to follow an RFC spec to its fullest extent, that does make sense and like everything's laid out. And he says what leads from that is that tech projects might just move to being about primarily spec writing, with repos primarily being worked on in a specs folder. And then the code test examples, perhaps even docs, he's saying are LLM as compiler output. This I don't really agree with, especially the specs being inside of the repo, because I feel like at big companies, there's always so much more than just the code sandbox, you know? There's all of the external stuff that's happening, and that's why you kind of need a Jira or a Linear or a Trello, is to like manage tasks that aren't specifically in the code. And you can use like one repo for it, but then it's like there's almost always a reason to have another repo. And maybe you're going to say, I'm going to use Turbo Repo and put everything in there, which is totally valid, but I still feel even beyond that, there's always going to be some external project management software where you're going to be working on these specs. However, definitely in terms of breaking up sprints and tasks individually, that's been done by humans in Jira, and that's why it's always trash because it takes so much time to move things around. But I think once we really have like an AI-driven project management platform, which there might be some that already exist, but that can like reorganize the epics, the stories, and the tasks, make sure everything's aligned and spec'd out, and through a conversational methodology where it like asks you questions, it makes you really think out the flow. I think that will live there, and then the sandbox code will kind of be an LLM as compiler output. And then also as well to his last point is that UX and taste will always be a piece. Even in the 2000s and the 2010s for startups, it was always about who has the best taste. Even though the code was much harder to deliver back then, you could make it happen, you know, with enough fundraising and with a big enough engineering team, but you still have to design a product and user journeys that make sense and are extensible. That's the main piece as well, is you can start with a greenfield project that has an UI/app layer that doesn't have to be stable, but once you have 100,000 customers on it, it does kind of need to be stable, you know, and secure, etc. So that's where the maintenance and the human layer comes in, and using AI to leverage the benefit of decision making and removing these like manual tasks such as reorganizing Jira tickets will be removed, and all that will matter is the thought process behind the engineers or the product people who are building it. Here we have a tweet from one of the general partners at Andreessen Horowitz Venture Capital, A16Z. His name is Martin, and he's saying basically something that I think a lot of people have been thinking about lately, which is that AI coding has made him quote unquote incredibly impatient for any config that isn't in repo. And I guess by repo, I don't know why people are using repo like this. Like it's in code, like you can have multiple repos, but I guess that's not what he's saying. But like infrastructure as code is becoming way more important now that AI can do all of these things, because like ChatGPT Atlas, for example, or like these browsers that can control, or even Claude Code, they can set things up in the UI, but there is kind of that weird trust layer, which is like we're so used to like if something is controlling my computer, that means I'm being hacked, and something really bad is happening. So that trust is kind of a problem, whereas with the terminals and the TUIs, we don't really have a problem with them using the GitHub CLI or the Railway CLI or the Fly.io CLI to deploy these projects. And that's where I feel like I've been behind a little bit, is with like agent driven infrastructure, because I'm still a bit scared about like it breaking things, or deleting the database or running a bad migration, or just not understanding like what environment it's on. So that is a bit scary to me, but I do think it's the future. I'm trying to get more into it, like embracing AI-driven infrastructure, using infrastructure as code with CI deployments, so then you can still have the human code review layer, and that also ignores that like the code rabbit guys think that human reviewed code is going away. Obviously, they're financially incentivized to believe that, but if you do look to the future, it's like, what are the things that the humans are for sure blocking? In my opinion, it's infrastructure and code review, and you can kind of fix the infrastructure with infrastructure as code and code review, but removing the code review and just merging when all of the checks pass, kind of like a trunk-based development or a continuous deployment methodology, could be very interesting. And that's a super old idea, continuous deployment. So it's really cool how these old like deep ideas always come back into AI, and like we're really forced to kind of review the first principles and the methodologies around the industry, because now we have the agents that can actually help us implement them, as opposed to just having to write a ton of YAML files manually. But it also gets to kind of what we talked about yesterday, which is there are people on the other side too that kind of have this fatigue with the chat-based interfaces, and they do want to use UI because they think that UI is an abstraction on top of human language that has been like infrastructure that we're losing now by reverting back to chat-based features. This kind of stuff interests you and you want to talk with some like-minded people, join the Audinato Discord in the description. Thanks.